I'm delighted to say that my usual co-host Ross has disappeared and we've upgraded to a very special guest. We have Sven Lorenz on the channel today. Thank you so much for joining us, Sven. On this channel, usually we talk about whiskey and single malts and get very detailed and very boring about the finest single cask single malts, but we are keen to broaden our horizons and learn more about other categories and other sectors. So do you mind telling us who you are, where you're from, and what you do as a day-to-day?
Absolutely. Delighted to. Hi, Laurie. Pleasure to be here. I'm Sven, and I'm probably best known for writing a blog called undervaluedshares.com, which is an investment blog. Sure. So I'm from the fund management industry, and I have been investing in the stock market my entire life. But I've had a bit of an interest in whiskey, and we'll come to that. Yeah. And we're obviously here in the building of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, which is part of a company that is listed on the stock market.
Yeah, which is quite unusual for the whiskey industry. When you found out, your eyes lit up. You're like, oh, amazing.
Absolutely, yeah. I organized a dinner here last night with fund managers from Edinburgh, and one of them mentioned that company to me. And I live with the delusion that I know most companies that are listed on the stock market. I hadn't heard of that one yet. And I looked into it, and again, we can talk about this a bit later. But I look at whiskey as something to enjoy. It's an alternative investment. Yeah. There's now a stock market angle to it as well. And I love history. And obviously, you have lots of history here in Edinburgh. And whiskey is all about heritage and history.
But in terms of your background, have you got a speciality? Because one of the questions I had was, obviously, the advice that you give in terms of shares are undervalued. You must have specialty or knowledge about certain industries or categories. Like, what's your focus?
I think my speciality is my curiosity and my gut feeling. Okay. I'm known to be onto new trends before others discover them. Okay. And in a way, I probably did that with whiskey as well, in the sense that in the early 2000s, I was very interested in whiskey. Okay. And this was a time when whiskey, Scotch, was just really out. Cared. And it was very much a drink for old men. And it was actually quite cheap as well. And I thought, given that there's only a limited amount of it, and also given that life experience in history shows you most things come back at some stage. They go out of fashion temporarily, but then they come back. I always thought there was an interesting investment angle to whiskey as well, which in the meantime has been proven right, because you know how prices for old whiskies have developed over the last 10 and 20 years.
Absolutely. Yeah, prior to Bevvy, I worked at one of the biggest online auction houses for whiskey, and it was crazy. The amount of whiskey being sold and the value of whiskey being sold. There was probably 50 lots every month selling for more than £10,000, and this was just one online auction. So yeah, very, very big money. For whiskey, obviously falls into the category of alternative investments, so kind of separate to stocks and shares, which is probably your speciality. But in terms of alternative investments, what's the main difference between those two? Is it less kind of risky? Is there less potential, or does it very much depend on what it is?
There's so many aspects you need to look at. And I think the most important one to start with is that it's something you can make yourself very familiar with, and something you can become an expert in yourself.
And passionate about as well.
Yeah. That's really something that I think is often forgotten when people speak about investing. And just as people get passionate about, for example, refurbishing a house or renovating an old building, I think you can become very passionate about whiskey, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with turning that passion into one of the pillars of your investing. I mean, don't put all your money into whiskey for obvious reasons. Yeah. But it's certainly something that I think has a very serious investment angle to it, and that's been discovered over the last 20 years. And I don't think, there will always be ups and downs in markets, but I don't think there's any reason why they shouldn't continue, because there's only so much of it going around, of the good stuff. Yeah. And human nature doesn't change. There's a growing middle class worldwide. We've seen how demand from Asia has changed.
Yes, it's an affordable luxury, and it's a status symbol. So I think it's always going to have that appeal, as you say, for special whiskey, whether it's special vintages or from famous distilleries. It's always, for me at least, it's always going to have some sort of tangible value.
Yeah, that's the good thing.
Yeah,
the bad thing in a way is, so one of the reasons why I never got into collecting whiskey or fine wine is because of the practicalities of it. It needs to be stored somewhere.
Yes.
There is the constant risk that you end up drinking it.
Yes.
Which, defies the investment angle. You have to speak about insurance. I have heard of all sorts of cases that, also show you the risk. For example, about 25 years ago, I was pretty close to actually wanting to collect or put away wine.
Okay.
In specialized warehouses that look after them. And I came across one story at the time where the operator of a warehouse for wine went bankrupt.
Oh, wow.
And the insolvency administrator sent a letter to all of the people who had stored wine there saying, you have to pick up your wine in the next 2 weeks, otherwise we'll sell it. And if you were on holiday or, you didn't get the letter for any reason, then your stuff was sold.
Tens of thousands of dollars.
And so it needs to be kept in mind that alternative investments are not easier. They are not less risky. They need looking after. And of course, you can do all of that, but you need to go into this with your eyes open.
Yes. Yeah. I suppose the positive with an alternative investment is that even if the value drops to zero, you've got a nice bottle of whiskey or a nice artwork or a nice vintage car or something. I suppose with stocks and shares, there's always that risk that value could drop to zero and you're left with absolutely nothing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it's tricky. Do you think, are there any alternative investments which you think should be sacred, that shouldn't be viewed as an investment? Because from my experience with whiskey, investment can be quite a dirty word. Like if you buy a bottle and say, I'm going to stick this away and hopefully it'll be worth a bit of money in the future. Some people get very angry saying whiskey's for drinking and there's been craftsmanship has gone into production of this liquid and it's been created to be enjoyed and savoured and shared. And the thought of, me having this bottle and putting it in storage for 20, 30 years gets some people very upset. Have you come across many
different things
examples
for different
like
people?
that? Yeah.
Each to their own, I'd say. Yeah. And most bottles that have been put away by someone for investment purposes eventually come onto the market again and then give someone even more joy because they're so old by that time. So I think investors just facilitate the enjoyment of very special bottles at a later stage by someone else.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Definitely. I think, again, from my time at auctions, we often talked about collectors and investors. And it was like, well, surely there's a big overlap between these two groups. Because if you're collecting whiskey, you don't have any intention of drinking it. So what you're going to sell it eventually. So surely you've got one eye on the investment side of it and the trends in value. So I think my view has always been, it's your money. You can spend it the way you want to.
Exactly how I see it as well.
Yeah, excellent. So in terms of whiskey, let's say we are a whiskey channel, we've brought on something quite special. This is a bottle of Macallan, which is very much a status symbol within single malt Scotch. This is a 1937 vintage expression, which we're going to try. I believe you've had some experience with Macallan in the past, particularly.
Absolutely. Back in the days when Scotch was out, I had the great fortune of getting an invite. I bought a ticket to a tasting organized by Macallan at Moseyman's, the very, very exclusive private members dining club in London. They've got a restaurant in Belgravia. It's in a 19th century church. Wow. Anton Moseyman is a Swiss restaurant operator who has been running this place for decades now, and with his son, and he's got a royal warrant for catering.
Okay.
So this was a very exclusive place, and Macallan wanted to live up to the venue and the whole circumstances. So during this tasting, they treated us to Macallan's starting somewhere in the 1960s and then going back. And we went to 1926. Little did I know how special from today's perspective that bottle of 1926 was back then and is today. Yeah. And speaking of investing, I absolutely loved the 1926 at the time.
That's not a big surprise. It's 6-year-old Macallan, so it's going to be it.
So I remember tasting wise, I'm not an expert, so I didn't take tasting notes, but sort of dried fruits, spicy. Yeah. And I remember it was just absolutely delicious, and it felt so special because my grandmother was born in 1920, and to drink something from 1926 to me seemed like unfathomable.
I love that, like old bottles. I remember there's a blend called White Horse, and I found a bottle that was bottled in 1953 or something. And having this bottle and opening it and thinking, this liquid has been in here since before my dad was even born. And you think of all the things that have happened in that time.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible.
And the reason why I remember it was in 1926 is because I again vividly remember how I was sitting there thinking, oh, this was 3 years before the stock market crash of 1929. And many, many years later, I saw that newspaper headline about a bottle of 1926 Macallan has changed hands for, was it 1.7 million? And then another has sold in the meantime for $2.7 million or something like that. And I asked at the time, like, how much are these bottles? And I could have had one for £8,000.
I mean, which at the time, I imagine you thought, that's an expensive.
It was a lot of money. It was not entirely unaffordable, but I didn't buy it because I thought, at some stage, I'm just going to open that bottle and drink it. And for that, it's too expensive. And I told your co-founder, Luke Herron, that story when Luke and I were in the Galapagos Islands recently on a boat, and we spoke about whiskey, and I told him that story. And he said, wow, so you drank a dram that must have been worth like $250,000. I said, actually, I drank 2 drams because I had a friend with me who didn't like whiskey that much, and by that time was completely drunk already. So I
bet he regretted missing that opportunity. The world's most expensive whiskey. He could have tried it. That's remarkable. I think that leads me to another question I was going to have about investment in general. Is there always, with hindsight, is there always that sense of regret? Obviously, investments you've made in the past that have turned out very well. Is there a sense of, maybe I sold too soon, or I should have invested more? So is it that downside of even when you win, there's that feeling of, I could have won more?
Yeah, I call them the coulda, shoulda, woulda investments.
Okay.
At the same time, as you get older and more experienced, you just know that realistically, would you have really held on to it for all that time? Yeah. So, I mean, I got some Bitcoin at $31. I sold them at 6,000. I was very happy at the time. Yeah. Of course, you now look at this, but I mean, that's life. And especially with a bottle of whiskey, had I kept one of these very special bottles at home, it probably would have been sold, drunk, done something with it at some point. I think if you just capture some of the upside, then you've already done pretty well, and you should be happy with that.
To, when you win, when you make good profit, just to draw a line under it, put a tick in the box saying that was a good thing to do, and then put it in the past and not overanalyze. Is that kind of the secret to not be beating yourself up, thinking, I could have pushed that an extra 6 months, I could have?
It depends on the circumstances, but I would say there's always another opportunity. Okay. There are so many ways how to invest your money. So if you've sold something, there's like a million ways how to put it somewhere else. Yeah. And I mean, now obviously we've had 20 years of whiskey having a very good run. And I don't know if you reinvest in stocks now, I don't know, AI or tech stocks or whatever tickles your fancy, There's so many ways to make money.
Absolutely. Well, without further ado, shall we have, this isn't the 1926, I'm afraid we're going to have to, I'm going to offend you horribly by just giving you the 1937. This liquid actually is very interesting because it was, I'll show you the label in a second. So it was distilled 1937, aged for 32 years, so bottled 1969. This liquid was rebottled as part of the Fine and Rare series that the 1926 was obviously the pinnacle of. So if you search for Macallan 1937 at auction, you will see bottles like this selling for maybe 3,000 or 4,000. You'll also see the Fine and Rare rebottling selling for about 30,000. And you think it's the exact same liquids. So I feel like that's posed some really interesting questions in terms of what are you paying for? Because it's clearly not just the whiskey, it's not just the liquid. Are you paying for the presentation, the prestige, the resale value?
And that's the great thing in investment terms. It's very complex. There's a lot of nuance to it. Yeah. And that's, for example, talking up Bevvy, you need an app like Bevvy to give you all the data so that you can analyze what you're exactly dealing with, because otherwise it'd be very difficult to research all of that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us again. Cheers.
Cheers.
Give us a little try.
Smells
Oh,
amazing.
it's very... I feel like whiskies from this era, you don't experience that same flavor profile with the whiskies that you do now. It's very
Generally
leathery.
unique.
Yeah.
And when I think what happened in the years when this was made,
Yeah, it's a real taste of history. It's fantastic. Obviously, trying this whiskey is a look back into the past, looking into the future in terms of investments. What sort of advice do you typically give to people that are perhaps new to investing, or obviously if there's no guarantees, it's all educated guesswork? Is it like, what do you suggest? Is it do your research, don't invest more than you can afford to lose? What are your sort of
so I'd say for a
key
start,
principles?
just take a little bit of money, something that's not too much, and just invest it into something that interests you. Because the moment you actually buy something for investment purpose, you look at it in a very different way than if you just look at it from the outside.
Sure.
So, take 500 quid or 1,000 quid and buy yourself, a selection of whiskies that you see as investment.
Yeah.
And your brain will start mulling things over and looking at the world in a very different way. And that's how you educate yourself, besides reading books and, watching podcasts, etc. And then I would say really even a step before investing is saving money. And I think just regularly putting away some money and putting it into something that you think is a good investment and that you might enjoy on top of it is a great approach, because life's actually pretty long. And if you regularly put money aside, it adds up.
Okay.
And I think that's really what gets people started. And the rest is just, be curious. And if you're interested in something, then it's not much effort and it's not hard work to, become an investor and educate yourself over time and just get started. That's really the main thing.
Okay.
There's nothing to be, afraid of.
Yeah.
Just start, do something.
And how important is it to be kind of preemptive and identify something as an opportunity before everybody else cottons onto it? So going back again to my experience with whiskey, working at a whiskey auction, seeing the likes of Macallan going up in value, I thought, I feel like I've missed the boat with Macallan, because everybody's now collecting Macallan and everybody's hoarding it and everybody's going to try and sell it in future and the market's going to be flooded. So my personal approach with kind of whiskey investment is to pick something that nobody cares about yet. So I've actually started looking at rum. There's a rum brand called Foursquare, which if you want to recommend to all your followers, that'd be fantastic for my personal portfolio. Foursquare has a lot of similarities with whiskey. There's vintages and cask types and all this stuff. So my hope is that whiskey drinkers who move into rum, Foursquare is going to be the Macallan of the rum world, which might not come true. But again, that thing with alternative investments, if the bottles end up being worth zero, I've got a load of delicious bottles of rum to drink and I'll be quite happy.
That sounds like a great approach, and you can combine that with keep your eyes open when you travel, when you go to events, what are people drinking and what is something that you haven't spotted before.
Yeah.
There are quite a few great investors who've become either wealthy or who've been successful fund managers on the back of going through life and business with their eyes wide open and seeing what are the products that their teenage kids are using or that they're seeing in more and more shops and supermarkets. There's probably the number one book that every investor or aspiring investor should read is Peter Lynch's One Up on Wall Street. Peter Lynch was a very famous investor and fund manager in the 1980s and 1990s, working for Fidelity. And he just said, I check out companies that produce the things that my wife is buying and that I see my kids buying or I see in shops. And it can be as simple as that. So I think you're onto the right thing here.
Interesting. And in terms of you personally, in the next few years, is there going to be more work on undervalued shares? What's kind of your plan personally for the near future?
Undervalued shares is both a passion project and a commercial project, which is probably why it's successful, because my heart is in it. I love writing about investing, and there are people following me for that very reason. And I'm also building a fund management business, but that's completely like a pure financial enterprise.
Sure.
And in terms of alternative investments, I guess I need to spend more time looking at that. I had another chapter where I did actually dabble in alternative investing. I once must have been 2004, 2005, I figured that vintage Ferraris would become a really good investment and collector's item. And they were pretty down and out at the time. Unbelievable from today's perspective. Now, what you don't know is that I don't have a driving license. So me buying or investing into a vintage Ferrari is seems like a silly thing. I bought one that I figured was going to be, it was very undervalued at the time relative to other cars. And I figured this is going to be a thing going forward. I bought it, and then storage and all the other hassle that came with it became too much after 2 years, and I sold it for the same price. It's up 11-fold now. So, so I think I need to get back into, following my instinct and looking at interesting alternative investments. So maybe I need to have another look at whiskey.
Yeah, I feel like any iconic brands, like you look at, like basketball shoes belonging to MJ and, Ferraris and even Macallans for whiskey. I feel like if it's an iconic brand, often that sticks for a while. So that's, often
especially, and that's actually one quite interesting aspect of it, iconic brands where the generation that experienced them as iconic is still fairly young. And once that generation gets to their 40s, 50s, and 60s, when they've got a lot of money, it suddenly becomes very sought after by a clientele that has money.
That's what we see with like baseball cards and Pokemon cards, and people who had them as kids think, actually, I've got 10 grand, I'll buy a
The last
Pikachu,
thing where I saw that happen with my own experience in it, so I grew up in the 1980s when home computers became a thing. Commodores and Amstrad and things like that. And we played all these computer games at the time. And 10 years ago, you could have bought these vintage games from the 1980s on eBay for £10, £20. And some of them are now going for hundreds or even thousands of pounds because suddenly my generation is feeling very nostalgic, is entering their midlife crisis. And we have the money to just say, I'll find that on eBay and whatever it costs, I'll just buy it, And that has driven up prices for computer games from the 1980s. Unbelievable.
It's amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming along. Obviously amazing to share a fabulous whiskey and share some investment chat as well. So lovely to chat a bit more, and we'll hopefully see you on the channel again soon.
Thank you, Laurie, and that was a very special week. Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more Bevvy content. We want to hear what you think, your best whiskey experiences, the whiskies you want to try. It's a really exciting journey we're on, so make sure to join us. Download the Bevvy app on Google Play and App Store to keep track of your whiskey journey, connect with your whiskey friends, keep track of your favourites, anything you could ever want to do with whiskey, all in one place. It's the definitive whiskey companion.